All right, hello and welcome to the first episode of Mad Scientist Brewing Beer Education Series. My name is Will Loliberty. I am the Mad Scientist who is going to be running this program. Just a bit of a background on me. I'm a certified Cicerone and lab manager at Bath Ale Works in Wiscasset, Maine, and just been interested in promoting beer education. It's a passion of mine, brewing and sharing all of this beer knowledge with people. I thought another fun way to do this and to improve my own beer education knowledge is to put together a series of videos and infographics and other things to share with people that based on questions I've had and just general information for anything that anyone might want to learn about how to brew, pairing beer and food, just background on different styles of anything. So that was kind of the basis for starting this off. So cheers to that. So this first episode, just wanted to kind of introduce both myself and also the topic about beer in general, because I don't know, some people might have a very low understanding or knowledge when it comes to some of the things I'll be talking about. So I wanted to throw in some definitions and terminology in this video because I'll be using them a bit more later on. But also talking about, uh, trying to define what is beer. So what is beer? It sounds like a silly question, but variations of fermented beverages have existed for thousands of years. For the purpose of our discussion, we're looking at a drink that is made basically from four ingredients. You've got a malted grain, which is typically barley. You've got hops, water, and yeast. Beer is a fermented beverage, which means it has gone through a process where yeast consumes sugars provided by the grain to produce alcohol and other byproducts which flavor the beer. And this fermentation process is used for other alcoholic drinks as well, like hard cider and hard seltzers, as well as kombucha and even soy sauce. So it's not necessarily going to always make something alcoholic, but it's the process by which the yeast is breaking down sugar to produce additional flavors. So it's kind of what it is that differentiates that from other uh, flavored drinks. And over the centuries, the ingredients of beer have changed quite a lot. So you've ancient civilizations that allowed honey or some wet cereal grains to sit out long enough that they caught wild yeast in the air, and that allowed it to ferment and create this kind of thick beverage that doesn't really resemble modern beer at all. And in time, people learned how to malt those grains and made it a lot easier to extract the sugars and use that to ferment the drink. Back in those days, a variety of different bittering herbs like bog myrtle and yarrow were added to balance with the sweetness of those grains. Uh, that kind of drink product was called gruit instead of beer. And that persisted until probably around the 14th century when hops started to get used more often in order to bitter the beer instead. In England, there was a specific distinction in calling the drink an ale if it was unhopped, or beer if it was made with hops. And in time, hops kind of became the universal bittering agent for the brewing process. But while all ales are beers, not all beers are ales. So this kind of leads into the next thing with this. I was going to look for beer terminology. So one question I get asked a lot is the difference between an ale and a lager, or even an ale and a beer. So as I just explained, beer is a product made of malted grains, hops, water, and yeast, which is fermented to produce an alcoholic beverage. Now, when it comes to ales and lagers, the distinction comes down to which yeast is used. I'll have a future video which really breaks down the differences and some classic examples of each, but for now all you need to know is that ale and lager are not actual individual styles, but rather a way to classify beer styles based on the yeast that is used to make them. Ale yeasts make ales, and lager yeasts make lagers. Ales ferment at warmer temperatures and have a bit of a fruitier or spicier flavor, which is made by the yeast. Lagers are fermented at cooler temperatures and are allowed to cold condition for long enough that they get sparkling clear and have very little yeast flavor. And neither kind of ale or lager is really better than the other, but it's undeniable that clean tasting lagers have dominated in popularity since they were first developed Most of the beers you'll find nowadays in Germany are almost exclusively lagers. Naturally, Budweiser and other American lagers have kind of taken a hold here in the U.S. Uh, outside of the craft brew industry, and similarly, international pale lagers like Heineken are very popular all around the world as well. So a few other definitions I wanted to add in here. The first is ABV, which stands for alcohol by volume. So this is simply the amount of alcohol per unit of volume of the beer, and it's just a measure of the amount of alcohol that's in there, and used to make an assessment of how much you should or should be consuming of this at any one time. There's another measure of this that used to be used called alcohol by weight, which is uh, similar, except it's the weight of the drink as a percentage versus the volume. But nowadays, that's not really used so much. The next definition is OG, which stands for original gravity. When you are brewing a beer and you soak your malted grains for a while, you'll get sugars out. So sugars will increase the density of your solution from plain water, which if you're using standard gravity measure, would come out as a value of just 1, to something that is more dense will be higher. I mean, anywhere like a typical ale, you might find an OG of starting gravity 1.050 isn't unheard of. Some really big ones like an imperial stout, you might get even 1.100. Um, there's another measure called degrees Plato, which is another way of measuring gravity, but it's just a different scale. So that's typically more, you'll see values like 12 degrees Plato is would probably be equivalent to the 1.050. Another definition is FG, which is just final gravity. That's the gravity reading that's taken after the beer is fermented. So you can use that based on the original gravity value to determine your alcohol content. Another one that I'm asked about frequently is IBUs, which stands for International Bitterness Unit. This is kind of a shorthand way of telling how bitter a beer is going to be, or rather, more appropriately, how hoppy a beer is going to be. So if you have something like a wheat beer is probably going to be rather low. It might be 10 IBUs, as opposed to a regular IPA could be up maybe 60, or double IPA 80 or more. It's not a strict measurement of how bitter a beer is, and I'll cover that in a different topic. But IBU is actually a scientific measurement when you put a beer sample into an analytical piece of equipment. It will give you a measurement, and the value that comes out is in a unit of IBUs. So it's really more for a measure of the amount of hop compounds that come out to add bitterness to the beer. The last definition is SRM, which is Standard Reference Method. And this is to determine the color of the beer. So this ranges anywhere from 1, which would be a very pale beer, to 40 or higher. So that's going to be your darkest beers, your stouts and such. So oftentimes if you're at a brew pub, you'll have your beers listed on the menu there, and it might even mention the SRM, but that's a good way to tell a general idea. And when you're analyzing these styles, if you're going to take one of the exams, if you want to practice your beer knowledge, you'll have to kind of memorize and understand all of these different aspects of a beer style, including IBU, SRM, and ABV. All right, the last thing I wanted to touch on was what I kind of call the governing bodies, which are really the people who are coming up with all this information and cataloging it. So the two main ones that are looked at are the Beer Judge Certification Program, or BJCP, and the Brewers Association. So between these two bodies, you're going to get a lot of information on collecting beer styles and best practices for brewing and the brewing industry. A few other associations are the American Homebrewers Association, which if you're a homebrewer, you may be involved with. They set up different competitions or recipe designs, things you can look into, and just improving your own skills as a home brewer. And the last is the Cicerone Certification Program. And this program is set up for the purpose of improving beer education and for people working in the beverage industry to have best practices for keeping and serving beer, having knowledge of styles, and being able to recommend food and beer pairings for people. So I'm at the second level of this, a certified Cicerone, and beyond that, there are two other levels, advanced Cicerone and a master Cicerone. The first level for this, which if you're in the beverage industry might not be a bad idea to look into, is certified beer server. This is going to cover basically anything you will need for being a beer tender or working behind a bar, whether it's setting up a draft line or how to properly pour a beer, keeping and serving things, knowledge of the beer styles, a lot of things that I'm going to cover in the video. I'm actually, in this series, I'm going to be using the Cicerone certification program as kind of a model for topics to cover, just because this is what I studied for and am continuing to study for. So that's kind of the introduction for what this series is going to be. Looking forward to getting to practice my beer knowledge and share that with you. I hope that you forgive these impromptu videos and my very basic understanding of video editing and trying to put this together. I'm far from a YouTuber. I'm just here for the beer. So I will see everyone the next time. And until then, cheers. Happy drinking.